we're now joined by, I'm proud to say this, my dear friend, Grant Wahl. Grant, how are you?
I'm good. How are you guys doing?
Great,
Well,
man.
I could not be better, actually. And,
That's because AC Milan won this weekend. It's the first time I've seen him smile at the beginning of the week.
In 10 years. It's been like the worst decade of my life when it comes to football. So at any rate, it has been all my Italian
every decade's been the worst decade of Rocky's life.
Yeah, he's a Newcastle fan. So Grant Wahl, welcome to the show. Grant, you have had #1 bestsellers in the soccer space, which is unheard of. I've always admired you. I've always admired your work. I even told him this, fellas, that Grant's now going to tell a story how he got me fired when he was at Sports Illustrated. This is a true story, Rocky. He got me fired from the MetroStars. My dream job to work in my own backyard. And what can I say except I do still love him. Grant, why don't you tell the story when you were at Sports Illustrated and now what you're doing now? Why don't you go into that?
Well, I do feel like I should tell the story about 1999, where typically at Sports Illustrated, they send writers in to do a story when a team is doing well, right? And so people are excited to see you, and you spend a couple of days and you write a story and you sort of parachute in and parachute out. And occasionally, very rarely, when a team is so bad that it's newsworthy that they're that bad, the editors at Sports Illustrated would send you in as a writer to write about how bad that team was. And would also
Rocky, don't laugh. Don't encourage her, Rocky.
And they'd also have the nerve.
The phrasing is so perfect. This whole framing of what's going to lead to your catastrophe, Charlie.
Demise is the word you're looking for.
And not only would they send me in, but they would send me in with the nerve of asking for interviews to talk about why they're so bad. And Charlie, being a good gent, agreed to be interviewed about why the MetroStars were so bad in 1999 and to sort of plead his case. And I let him do that, and he was very pleasant about it. And I also spent time for that story with fans who were not thrilled but had sort of been diehards. And they talked about not fan appreciation night, but fan depreciation night, I think was one line in the story. And I wrote the story and appreciated Charlie, being willing to talk to me. And it was sort of about the whole MetroStars situation. And unfortunately, I think there was a New York Times story too. So I don't get 100% of the blame. And you still speak to me, and you're a good friend of mine, which is very nice.
Yes.
But you did lose your job soon thereafter.
I did lose my job. And Rocky, I have to bring this one point up, Rocky, that when you lose your job in sports, it's very public. And we're going to talk about that in a second, Grant. And it's very public. And I had a neighbor across the street used to rub it in on me, and he'd say, "Hey, I saw you lost your job today." And I used to say to him all the time, "Listen, jerk, but I came up with the name MetroStars. Myself, Jay Berhalter, Chris Unger, and a friend of mine, Paul Campana. I said, they'll never take the name away." I wake up one morning, go to get the paper in front of the house, and the guy comes out and he goes, "Hey, they took the name away," when the Red Bull bought it. I was like, "You miserable bastard, you."
I will say this before I tell my own story about losing my job very publicly, is that I feel like losing that job allowed you, Charlie, to create what you have created.
Thank you.
In terms of summer tournaments, in terms of your radio career, in terms of all this stuff, and also led to coming full circle. About 3 years ago, I wrote a story on you for Sports Illustrated, calling you the best connected American in European soccer.
Still is.
Which is true.
I thank you, Grant. And I never actually blame you. I blame myself for my demise. But one thing is good.
Can we just ask you?
Pick yourself up. You pick yourself up and you move forward. Okay? That's all I can say.
Can we just ask you, who, when they lost their job, talked more, Charlie or Gary Neville at Valencia?
A good question. I'd probably go with Gary Neville on that one. Charlie didn't do a lot of talking immediately after that, but
I want to listen to me. So go ahead, Grant. Tell us what happened to you. A very public, you're a person. I want to frame it properly.
right.
You have been the head writer for Sports Illustrated, as I like to say, from the time when Sports Illustrated, now we're both Princeton guys, we could say this, it was a Princeton outfit years ago. And it was a very sort of family-run business, and very proud and great journalism. And you were really at the height of Sports Illustrated and at the height of really soccer coming back into this country. And you've done an incredible job. And here you are, the #1 writer in America, in my opinion, but not just my opinion, most people's opinion. And suddenly, what happened?
Yeah, so I mean, Sports Illustrated changed. I was there for 23 years, and it was literally still is the only full-time job I've ever had. And I went full-time soccer in 2009, but I covered soccer going back to 96 there, and really made it sort of my career mission to make soccer bigger in the U.S., to do my part for that. And I'm really proud of that, whether it's the growth of the U.S. game, men's and women's, whether it's European soccer getting bigger in the U.S., just telling stories, covering events, making it, making soccer just as big as any of the other sports we covered at Sports Illustrated. And that was a long fight, because in the 90s, it was impossible to get soccer in the magazine. And that changed over time a little bit. But especially online, digital, there's a ton of content I produced over the years. And then Sports Illustrated got new ownership last year. And that new ownership is a group called Authentic Brands. They licensed out the operation of Sports Illustrated magazine and website to a group called Maven. Maven's strategy is basically clicks and quantity, and it's not quality, which is the tradition of Sports Illustrated.
Yeah.
And so
Way of the world.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that Maven did coming in last October was they laid off 40% of the national staff, some really good people, and that was obviously a red flag. Lots of other red flags happened subsequently. And, I have always been attached to SI and wanted to try and make it work, and was actually producing tremendous amounts of quantity and quality in the first few months of 2020 under the new ownership, because they were demanding so much stuff. But, I had a good magazine story on Jurgen Klopp. I had kind of an expose on Jermaine Jones teeing off on American soccer. I broke the news of Chicharito signing with the LA Galaxy, which was sort of the news of MLS, the biggest news. So I felt like I was at the top of my game. Then the pandemic hit. They laid off more people, because these guys are really leveraged, Maven, and not financially secure. And so what they were trying to do, and I made this public, was we were all fine taking pay cuts during the pandemic because we understand the situation, but they were trying to force through long-term pay cuts beyond the pandemic and force us to sign those contracts. And so I called that out publicly, said I didn't think that was right, and I got fired. No severance, no anything, no healthcare. So, beyond that, the guy who runs Maven put out a statement, basically bashing me. And
I saw that, and I thought it was unprofessional, and it was an out-and-out lie.
On that, Charlie, can I just ask, Grant, how was the actual firing handled? Did they do it face-to-face?
No, and like the thing about it was, to put out a statement saying that I wrote infrequently, basically saying I didn't work hard. That was literally false. I mean, I had agreed in my agreement with them to write 100 stories this year, which is a lot.
It's a lot of stories.
And I was on pace for 168. I was one of the biggest quantity producers on the national staff. So it's just false. And so it was an interesting experience though, because it put me typically when a sports journalist gets let go, it's not the subject of stories in newspapers. And this was in the Washington Post. It was in the New York Daily News and Post. And it gave me a sense of what it's like for a coach to lose his job, or a GM, Charlie, and to do it in a way that didn't feel like it was handled correctly. And also that they put out my income. It was, this is stuff that it was interesting for me to experience, sort of like what an athlete must feel like to have his income out publicly and know that the public knows that. And, I don't know. It was an interesting experience, not one that I would prefer to go through again, but it does give you an idea of what it's like if you're a coach who gets sacked and potentially, unfairly gets sacked.
Well, Charlie, if we're going to move on to a lot of other things.
Well, what is he doing now, though?
I just wanted to say that I remember that morning when it was, and I didn't believe it. I was staggered myself because this isn't patronizing, Charlie, Neil. We know this lad, the quality of work in investigative journalism that he does, and the manner and puts it out and stylistically, is a joy to read, always informative, and it's typical Grant Wahl. It was amazing that morning that I read it. And again, I'm not blowing it up your ass, Grant. This was truly shocking, Charlie, of any football journalist that I've ever known to be treated that way, especially Grant.
No, and what's the situation now?
So I started my own podcast. It's called Football with Grant Wahl. I wanted to sort of keep my name out there and just do what I love doing, before I get my next job. And so it's twice a week, comes out Mondays and Thursdays. And I thought I could get good guests. It's an interview-based podcast, and I've been able to do that, which is nice. Jurgen Klopp came on the podcast, Lothar Matthäus, and you guys have these guys on every once in a while too. So it's, it's not always easy to get big guests to come on a show. So, we had Henrik Mkhitaryan. We have a lot of US based guests too. So, all of that has been fun to get going again. I have a 2-month super secret project I'm working on right now that's going to come out in August, which I'm excited about. And then at some point in the next 2 to 3 months, I'm going to take a full-time gig somewhere like national, global. And, fingers crossed, it looks like right now I'm going to have a choice on what that next gig is. So that it's all going to work out in the end, and it's going to be a better situation. It already is. And, while I would have preferred not to have gone through this with Sports Illustrated, I hope Sports Illustrated gets there. There's still a lot of friends of mine who work there. They're going through some real issues at that place, and I hope, it gets going in the right direction.
Wow. Okay. Grant, look, we wish you well. I mean, I can only say that if we're half as successful as you are in your podcasts, we will really be doing well. I want you to know that. So, but let's switch gears over to MLS. This is one of these times Giorgio Canali used to tease all the time, rest his soul, MLS, what a mess, when they would get things wrong and along the way. And look, there's been a lot of ups and downs, and I cannot possibly blame MLS for this COVID thing. Okay.
Right.
And I think they're doing things right, but your tweet the other day, where you talked about how it's symptomatic of the country more than it is MLS. Could you enlighten us a little bit on that?
Well, I mean, there's obviously a reason why Germany and the Bundesliga, they were able to come back before any other major league, is because Germany as a country handled the virus better than the rest of us. And, you look at the other countries that have slowly come back and they've done a pretty decent job with it. If we're being honest, the US has done the worst of any country in the world when it comes to the virus, and it's not even close. So
undoubtedly, yeah.
That's why it's taken so long for sports to come back in the US. And also, as we see cases spiking around the country right now, 50,000 cases a day, which is insane. Why it's really difficult to try and get sports going again. And MLS, NWSL started again a couple weekends ago. They, I think, have a few advantages over MLS. There's fewer teams. They still, at the NWSL, had one team, Orlando, that couldn't play in their bubble tournament because they had positive COVID tests. And so what's happening now is this MLS bubble tournament is supposed to start on Wednesday in Orlando, and there's 26 teams in the league. So that's different than the NWSL's 9. And you've got teams that are flying in from all over the country from hotspots. One of them is Dallas. So there's COVID in Dallas right now. There's a lot of it in Texas. And so it's not surprising that you've had 10 cases at this point of FC Dallas players testing positive, players and coaches. So they've already had to postpone or push back the Dallas opening game in this tournament. It looks like Nashville, which is supposed to play Wednesday night, is going to have its game pushed back because they've had positives. And so the big concern right now, like, safety is the most important thing with the MLS tournament. And so you don't want transmissions to take place inside the bubble. Typically what's happening now is players are getting tested as they come into the bubble, and that's when they're testing positive. And that's not good, but it would be terrible if new cases start getting transmitted inside the bubble. And I don't see how you can even have a tournament at that point.
No, I totally agree. I mean, it's been awful here in the UK as well, Grant. And you do look around the world and see that Vietnam is the biggest nation with no deaths whatsoever. And you do just wonder about all the hype in these first world countries about our health systems and our political administration. MLS administration. I understand why they went for this kind of World Cup style of tournament structurally. I think it's a great idea because the season, there was 2 games old. There was no investment in it at that stage, and it didn't need saving as such. And a more independent tournament seemed like a great idea. But what will make it worth it, and what will make it not worth it?
I mean, if your players aren't safe, if they're getting cases because they're participating in this tournament, then that's the priority. That's the priority by far. And so if they can make it safe, then the soccer could be good. Like you said, I mean, the idea is not a bad idea. And, my wife's a doctor, infectious disease doctor, medical analyst for CNN. And, I think NASCAR even made it public. She's been consulting for NASCAR in terms of their return to staging events. And so a lot of public health experts like her have worked with the different sports leagues when it comes to planning this return. And so MLS has been working with very good people to try and see if there was a way to get this tournament going. And what is interesting was the first plans for this MLS tournament did involve a longer stay in Orlando for the players, in part because they wanted to have a longer quarantine period before the tournament started. And the players union bargained that down. Now, I understand where they were coming from, because the players didn't want to stay, didn't want to be away from their families for 2 months in Orlando. And so they cut down the time. And the NBA players, for example, when they go to Orlando for their tournament, have more time for quarantine before that tournament starts. So,
but they're better paid.
They are better paid. And you still have some NBA players opting out, and MLS players aren't in a position, except in a few cases financially, to say, no, I'm not going to do this, And MLS also was very clear in saying to its players, you are required to be here unless you have a pre-existing condition or you have some type of situation like Carlos Vela does with his wife being soon to give birth. Very different also from the NWSL, which said to its players, we will still pay you your salary even if you decide not to come. And so I do wonder right now, at this very moment, how many MLS players, if you gave them that option, like, we'll still pay you and you don't need to be here, how many would stay in Orlando?
Well, what about the players that are sick, Grant, that have tested positive and they can't go, or they can't play, I'm assuming, but maybe I'm wrong here. Help me out with that. Do they still get paid?
Good question. I am pretty sure that is the case. They are not choosing to not play. So it's not a situation where if you happen to pick up a positive that suddenly you're not being paid. That would be unfair. Players who are testing positive upon entering the bubble are being quarantined for several days. Ideally, it should be 2 weeks. But I mean, that's where some of the concerns lie, is how impermeable is the bubble? You already have some staff people in hotel staff that, are not under quarantine, and Orlando is a hotspot. So I know a lot of planning's been put into this. I know that MLS, league staff and team staff have put so much of themselves into this, and you just, at this point, hope they can pull it off.
Yeah.
And will the product, if they do pull it off, if it goes really well, and fingers crossed, that's what we all want, if they do pull it off, will the product be good enough to attract television viewers?
Oh, yeah. I think this whole stretch here is a real opportunity for the sport of soccer in America to get new eyeballs that it hasn't had before. And that goes back to the start of the Bundesliga, because soccer's been the only live team sport on American television for a while now. And that will be the case until the end of July. So, the NWSL, I think, missed an opportunity here, because all their games are on this, CBS All Access that you have to be, only a hardcore fan can get that. But the MLS games are going to be on ESPN, on Big Fox, on FS1. These are going to be channels that sports fans in general get. And I think it is a real opportunity to not just satisfy soccer fans who want to see a lot of soccer, because there will be a lot of soccer in this MLS tournament, but potentially get new people to come in. Now, how that product looks on television is going to be interesting, because, and I'm never sure exactly how I'm going to feel, because I thought before we heard the fake crowd noise that would be awful, and it hasn't really been awful.
It's been great. Come on.
I know some people don't like it, but I kind of like it. It's interesting. These NWSL games are taking place in this tiny stadium out in Utah, and I thought that might look bad, but it actually doesn't. And so even though these MLS games are not taking place in sizable stadiums, empty or not, I don't think that's going to be an issue in terms of the product. And from what I hear, the television broadcasts for the MLS games are going to have some new bells and whistles that might actually make it a better viewing experience, or at least a novel viewing experience that fans might like.
Yeah, why not? It's madness that we're all living in, and this is a bizarro world. So any bells and whistles, like you say, including the sound noise. Speaking as a commentator myself, I ask, and I'm working from home when we're doing the La Liga games, and it's horrible. It's awful being away from Phil. I never thought I'd say that, but I miss the big guy. I miss him.
He says the same about you.
Yeah, and I'm right next to him, and there's a chemistry there. And it's doing the games virtually. It is awful. And there's so many aspects of our game that we're having to readjust to. And I think the fans understand so much of it as well. But I think for MLS, Grant, it seems to be a real a challenge in a different way. Everything's different. This is a different challenge. When all's said and done, what can we expect when it is going to be held up against a very similar product in La Liga, in the Bundesliga, in Serie A, in the EPL, because there's no crowd? You always hear that the EPL, that's what big component of EPL football is the atmosphere, the passion, the crowd engagement in the various stadia. And now it's all the same. It's all bland. I personally hate it. I hate this time we're living through, and I don't care who knows it, and I don't care who hears it, because I think the whole thing stinks. And that's the way you got to live with it. You got to live with the stink and the stench that this pandemic has bestowed upon us. But on the footballing side, Grant, when all's said and done, what do you think we can expect in terms of quality of football? Because, like it or not, that's what's going to be leveled up against the likes of Juventus and Barcelona and Manchester United and Chelsea, on and on. That's part of the deal here for me.
Yeah, and it's a concern. I mean, like, I will say, I don't think the quality of the European leagues that we've seen has been necessarily bad. And I should also say here, like, I understand everything you're saying, right? But your calls of, like, yesterday's Barcelona goals, that gave me real joy. So I want to thank you for doing that.
Thank you, Grant.
And that's a real, like, and getting to see Messi play and do Messi things does give me joy. In terms of MLS, like, there are teams right now, like literally Dallas is all quarantined. They're not training right now. That's been a problem for Nashville as well. And so I do have concerns about that. They're going to be playing in really hot, really humid conditions in Orlando, kind of surface of the sun type stuff.
Brutal down here, Grant, really.
And I know that, like, the game kickoff times are supposed to accommodate that. So it's like basically 8:30 p.m. Eastern, 10:30 p.m., and then 9 a.m. Eastern. But that's still going to be tough. Yeah. I think they're going to want to use their 5 subs, but it is a concern for me with MLS that they haven't had a chance to train as much as maybe they could have. And, you know, they'd only played 2 games in the season before the virus hit. Yeah. And so, we'll see, you know, like, I will say this, like it feels like even though it's not the same without fans, I'd rather have soccer than no soccer as long as it's safe.
Yeah, there's just no easy answer to this, Charlie, for me. The responsibility on the players to perform well, for these neutral observers that turn on ESPN to watch MLS. We've got professional sports. We've heard about these teams. I'm talking about my next door neighbors that don't watch Major League Soccer. They don't watch soccer. But this is going to be able to be tuned in locally, and they're going to be judged on this. There's a responsibility on these players to perform well, and the coaches, make no mistake about it. For me, they cannot. This isn't a situation where they're going to be able to duck out of it. It's a great opportunity for Major League Soccer, a great one. They've got to seize it for me. They've really got to grab this one and play as balls out and play like this tournament really does mean something. And I think the league's given them as many incentives as they can, except the sandwiches. Right?
we're getting the games.
I sent that around the other day.
We got to talk about this.
Yeah,
really.
No.
Just before we do, we're getting the games over here in the UK as well, albeit a lot of them at night. So just before we talk about the sandwiches, Grant, give me 3 players to look out for.
Well, I mean, Chicharito Hernandez got off to a rough start early on in his first 2 games with the Galaxy. They just seem to be trying to hit crosses into him, which isn't his thing. And so, this is the biggest addition to the league this season, and can they get things going? I don't know if they can. So I think Chicharito's a guy to keep an eye on. I look at Seattle, like Seattle-Toronto has been the final 3 of the last 4 years. And so they obviously play good. They play well in tournaments. And so either team is capable of doing well. I think Josie Altidore is a guy for Toronto who's, if he's healthy, could have a really big impact, but he's had injury issues in summer tournaments quite a bit. So if he's healthy and performing, I think Toronto has a chance to win this thing. And then Carlos Vela, the reigning MVP, is he going to go? Because if he goes, he's the best player in the league. But his wife is due to give birth soon. He is being allowed to choose to not come if he doesn't want to be with his family. And that hasn't been announced yet. But, you know, he's still at a very high level in this league. And if he doesn't play, if he does play, I think LAFC should be the favorite. If he doesn't, they're not.
Neil, I'll give you three names for. I'm going to wave my Fort Lauderdale into Miami flag here. There's three players for me that have been a pleasure to watch. Although one, Carranza, these are all Inter Miami players, Neil. Carranza, dynamite player forward, and Rodolfo Pizarro is a talented footballer that you will enjoy watching. Sweet on the ball, visionary. But I want to put a big shout out as well for the young Yank, Robbie Robinson. Now, I hadn't seen much of this kid at all. This is the lad who won the prestigious Herman Trophy that our beautiful Charlie Stillitano was robbed when he was nominated for that trophy back in his heyday at college. Charlie was there. He was in the reckoning, which says a hell of a lot.
Final 10.
That's right.
Final 10.
That's right. But you were in the rearview mirror in the end. But you were in the mix. You were nominated, Charlie. But Robbie Robinson, Grant, I tell you what, this was a lovely little player. His first two games, tall, lanky Neil, but a good hold-up player, good skill on the ball, still coming out of his footballing shell. But I was impressed. But Pizarro is a lovely footballer.
I'm really excited to hear Ray Hudson calling Miami. I kind of wish we were doing it during this tournament, but
I look forward to it.
Based on what we've seen so far, and it's a small sample size, Inter Miami looks like they'll be able to compete this season.
Yep.
Well, let me switch gears, and you've been so generous with your time, Grant.
Hang on, Charlie. The sandwiches.
Oh yeah, go ahead. First the sandwiches, then I have to ask a question. I mean, for the listeners who don't know about it, the sandwiches are. There was an article in the Post, I think it was page 6 or something like this. But anyway, New York Post, and it basically said that they were charging $65 for these sandwiches that were a box lunch and looked like they were worthy of 1975 school lunches out of Philadelphia. That's what they look like to me.
My comment was that Jack Warner must have gotten the player food contract for MLS during the MLS's back tournament. But $65, that was the quarantine box lunch, I was told, at the hotel. And Omar Gonzalez from Toronto was the guy who retweeted that, put it out for the public. And occasionally he's put more things about what it actually is like on the inside of the MLS bubble. In MLS's defense, they do say that, like, once you're out of the initial, 24-hour quarantine, that you have restaurants and stuff inside the hotel. So not every meal is a box lunch, but that looked like a lot of media box lunches I've seen over the years.
Yeah, it did, didn't it? It really did.
You guys are familiar.
Hey,
well, I want to say this to you, Ray. I have to tell you this. Giovanni Savarese and Roberto Donadoni, early days, when I was still at the MetroStars, they used to bring a hot pot and pasta and literally, and they would make pasta and tomato sauce for themselves in the hotels that we went to, the different Marriotts and Holiday Inns we stayed at. And so Gio Savarese and Roberto Donadoni used to make pasta for themselves because they couldn't eat the hotel food.
Wow. Nice.
How's that?
I'll tell you what, talking of media lunches, the most disappointed I've ever been was the Paris Saint-Germain press room, where you go in and it was
it was
even worse than Barcelona, and that's saying something.
Oh yeah.
I want to switch gears because
before you do that, Chaz, I do want to say Chelsea, Neil, is known as the best media food anywhere for any media. I've experienced that a few times over the years, but when I had a chapter of my book on David Beckham's experience in America with the LA Galaxy, where they would have meals on the road where they served fried chicken right before games. And Beckham would get fried chicken, or he would see the fried chicken and just basically be like, what is this?
Well, I
Well,
tell you what, Charlie, I'm going to tell you this. I'm going to let a little
please go for
one
it.
out of the bag here, because I'm saving one of my lanes. You know, people ask me, how do you come up with these lanes? You save them. You wait for the right moment. And I was waiting for a moment yesterday from Antoine Griezmann, who's been a bit of a disaster at Barcelona, but played spectacularly well yesterday. Back to his World Cup winning
He was
best.
great. He was great.
And I was going to say, this guy has been a bigger waste of money than an Omar Gonzalez sandwich. But it didn't happen. It didn't happen.
You said something that when he scored that goal and you said it was so sublime, Rocky, you were amazing. You were amazing. Grant, I'm going to switch gears. Like I said, you've been so generous with your time, but I wanted to switch gears to US Soccer. There has been a lot written, a lot of changes the past few years. Take us through some of the big moments, if you could. Carlos Cordero stepping down, Parlo stepping in, the women's lawsuit that the women lost, and oh boy, and where are we now? Will Wilson's the new CEO. Where are we? Are they back on track? Is it still, well, I'll leave it to you.
I mean, in the big picture, U.S. soccer hasn't been the same since the men failed to qualify for the World Cup in 2018. And that set off a chain of events that continue to happen. And so change has been the defining characteristic of the federation since 2018. So early 2018, you had, 8 candidates for president. Carlos Cordero wins that election. And then there's been this lawsuit from the U.S. women's players, which continues in terms of equal pay, gender discrimination. Part of that got dismissed, the equal pay part, by a judge, but it's being appealed. And there's other things in that case that are still active. The U.S. women did win the World Cup in 2019, and that got them a lot of positive publicity. But because of the lawsuit, it's kind of like the public views that women's team is succeeding despite U.S. soccer, not because of it. And then you have, really in the last year or so, almost all of the big figures running U.S. soccer have departed. The big figures from the past 20 years. So Dan Flynn was the CEO going back to like 2001. He finally retired, or at least left U.S. soccer.
It should be said he had a heart transplant, and he's doing great.
Which is good.
He's doing great. And I just talked to him just 2 days ago. So that was
good to hear. So, he left as the CEO. He got replaced by Will Wilson recently, who's just sort of getting going. One of the first big decisions he made was to discontinue the development academy, which they cited COVID partly, but that was a big decision.
And what'd you think of that? I mean, that's an important development, isn't it? Or am I
It is, and like MLS has sort of taken it over, very like the function of organizing youth clubs in the U.S. And they seem to be doing it in a way that is, they're making some decisions that the public is more okay with, I think. Like they were, the federation was forcing kids to either choose to play high school soccer or be in the development academy. You couldn't do both. And now that's going to be allowed, it sounds like. So we'll see if MLS can sort of take that over on the development side. And then Cordero ends up resigning as U.S. Soccer president back in March. And that was after he basically took the responsibility for this legal strategy that had gone public against the women's team, in which they were arguing that women were inherently lesser than men when it came to ability, skill, responsibility. And their own sponsors came out really strongly against U.S. Soccer publicly. And you knew at that point that heads were going to roll. It ended up being Carlos Cordero, who resigned. The chief legal officer of U.S. Soccer was out afterward as well. And then Cindy Parlo-Cohn, who was the vice president, becomes the president when Cordero resigns. And so far, what we've seen from her is she has stated publicly, along with Will Wilson, the CEO, they want to resolve this case with the U.S. women's national team. They got sort of an unexpected boost when the judge dismissed the equal pay claims. And I think it was also a pretty major decision recently that Cindy Parlo-Cohn pushed through repealing this rule that had been passed about kneeling during the national anthem after Megan Rapinoe had done that to protest police brutality toward Black Americans back in 2016. They put in a rule, the federation, saying that you had to stand. And then after the NFL changed course, US Soccer did as well with all the protests that have been happening. So all those things are pretty big. And also it's about who's not there now. Dan Flynn's not there. Sunil Gulati is no longer on the board. Jay Berhalter, who had been Dan Flynn's right-hand man for so long, is no longer there. So there's a lot of turnover inside US Soccer. And then you have another election coming in February to see who's going to be the president. And then another election a year later is the regular election. So like, there's a lot of politics happening. And I guess the question becomes, does Cindy Parlow-Cone actually want to continue being the US Soccer president, or is someone else going to end up running?
I want to take a step back to the development academy, development of soccer. I see so many young American players coming up, but they're all coming up in Europe. And look, I'm going to admit it. I miss Ibra. I miss Wayne Rooney. I miss Carlos Vela if he doesn't show up to this, you know. And it's great that Ray is you know, an announcer and is able to point out players for us. Hard, honestly, to do when you have to really, as you said, watch the players, see the quality, and in some cases these guys aren't even practicing. That's, to me, it could be really, really tricky. What is going on with our American players? I look at a kid like Pulisic, and we were talking today that this kid is the real deal and is going to be, I think, you know, the first true American superstar player in Europe. Because we've had great players, Claudio Reyna, Tab Ramos, you know, name a few that have just been amazing. And of course, in goal, we've had world-class players. Right. But this seems to be the first world-class, a guy that we'll all recognize, every kid will recognize, not just American soccer fans.
Yeah, and I mean, what Pulisic's doing right now is the best form of his career so far. He just needs to keep doing it. You know, I think one of his big issues over time has been kind of getting injuries from time to time, and his momentum gets stalled. But, you know, what he's been lately for Chelsea is decisive in the outcomes of games in a way that he never really was at Dortmund in most cases. He did score a goal that sent Dortmund to the Champions League quarterfinals against Benfica a few years ago.
Sure.
But, you know, most of the time he was a little bit too complimentary, not, you know, decisive enough. And now with Chelsea, he's playing like a $72 million player.
And is that because, let me ask you, Grant, is that because, you know, I had a law school professor that ended up going to Princeton, and he was really hard on me all the time. And I said to him, Professor, why are you so hard on me? And he said, because I can't sharpen a knife with butter. And it seems to me that I thought he was Ray Hudson at first when he said that to me. But I mean, it seems like we talked about the development academy here. And the question I have, it just seems like the players that are really developing are the kids that are going to Europe.
Well, I mean, if you look at Christian Pulisic's example and Giovanni Reyna's example, they both had the benefit of having an EU passport that allowed them to go to Europe long before they turned 18 and be part of the development system at Dortmund, which is probably the best place to be.
Yeah.
And so if you have that ability to get an EU passport and do that like they did, I think that's been a huge part of them accelerating to where they are now at such a young age. You know, it's not, you know, obviously not every American kid's going to have an EU passport. So if you're Weston McKennie, you're in the FC Dallas development system. And I think Dallas has done a pretty good job developing players over the years. And so, you know, McKennie is with Dallas, turns 18, is able to go to Germany when he turns 18, go to Schalke, and look where he is right now. Schalke's not in a great place, but, you know, he's in a position where they're probably going to sell him, and he's going to go to a better destination at the age of 21. And that's good for Weston McKennie, and also shows that MLS, I think, can produce some players. And keep in mind, Giovanni Reyna was part of the NYCFC academy system before he ended up deciding to go to Dortmund. So I just think that the MLS development academies just need to do a better job producing more good, promising players. They've started to, but not enough. And that's the challenge right now. And actually, I think it's not on US Soccer so much to be developing players. I think it's on MLS teams. And we'll see now if they're able to start doing that with more regularity.
You know, it's not just the Giorinas and the Christian Pulisics, excuse me, Neil, that are starting to grow eyeballs, particularly in Germany. The 3 young kids at Bayern Munich that are playing in the second, well, it's like the 3rd division, isn't it? They've been really good, impressive young players, Grant, that are starting to get noticed. One of them in particular, Richards, got called into the first team as well. So it's not all just about the big superstars. There's a lot of other players. Timothy Tillman, another one, is his younger brother, has started to come through the ranks and get good attention, which is a great thing and really understated.
Yeah, I mean, Germany especially appears to be the place where, you know, young Americans, young players in general are getting opportunities. So for Chris Richards to be on the fringes of Bayern Munich that's a real advance. I do think he might go out on loan next season, but we'll see there. Like, they seem to like him, you know. But other players like Josh Sargent at Werder Bremen, I think he's had an up and down year, but I think it's valuable experience for an American striker, and we'll see if they can end up, you know, staying in the Bundesliga. But you know, if you look around, there's other young players getting those opportunities, especially in Germany. And we'll see. I mean, like I mentioned Dallas again. Reggie Cannon is another young player who has one time with the national team at right back, just signed a new contract, but that is all as a setup to send, you know, for him to be sold to a European team and take the next step.
Developing good.
Christian,
Neil, one last question for Grant.
Yeah, Christian and Gio Reyna have such technical talent. But overall, with a lot of these youngsters coming through, I still see technical talent is what needs to be improved the most. The physical, increasingly the tactical talent is there, not so much the technical. Do you see that?
Yeah. You know, that's always been the issue with American players is there's not enough technical skill and it's too much about athleticism. And obviously in the modern game, athleticism is important, but you know, you need to be able to have the skills. And, you know, like I look at a player like Weston McKennie, and I think he's got a sense of where he needs to be on the field. Sometimes I do feel like his technical skills aren't maybe where they need to be yet, but they can get there. He's just 21. But yeah, you look at Reyna, you look at Pulisic, and there's just such confidence on the ball. And as a national team, you don't need 11 players like that. I am optimistic about, you know, we haven't even mentioned Tyler Adams and what he's doing for RB Leipzig. Just, I think the U.S. has a core now of young players, as long as they're healthy, that, you know, is pretty good when you look at Pulisic, Reyna, Adams, McKennie, Tim Weah, if he can get things going again. And those players are all in their very early 20s.
Grant Wahl, I can't thank you enough for your time, my friend. It has really been enjoyable. I could stay here for 12 hours with you, but then you'd fire me again.
Always a pleasure. Thanks for having me, guys.
Thanks, Grant.
Thanks, Grant.